Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. Tonight we're talking about the fine-tuning argument, and really we're discussing and answering a bunch of objections to the fine-tuning argument. A few days ago, I went onto Facebook and Twitter and even in the YouTube community tab, and I asked you guys for some objections to the fine-tuning argument. And so tonight, that's what we'll be discussing with one of the foremost experts on this question, on this topic, is Dr. Robin Collins. He's here with me. Robin, it's great to meet you. I know that we talked just briefly about the fact that you've been a real source of inspiration for me. Your work and reading about the fine-tuning argument is just been a real blessing to me. So so I really appreciate you coming on. And then along with Robin, we have Josh Rasmussen here to kind of fill out the rest of the philosophical case, so to speak, and to help us just think about different things that we may not be seeing. So that's what we're doing tonight. And so what I want to do at the outset, Robin, is have you kind of give like your basic outline of the version of the fine-tuning argument that you defend in your work. And then from there, we'll move into the objections. But I think it's important that we just sort of give an overview of what this argument is for anyone who might not know. And then also we're going to use that framework that you build at the outset, and we're going to use that throughout our discussion tonight. So take it away.
Okay, so the fine-tuning argument, of course, starts with the fine-tuning evidence. And that evidence is that the laws of nature, the initial conditions of the universe, and specifically what are often called the constants of physics, are really like the fundamental parameters of physics, have to be adjusted just right in order for life to occur. So examples of this are the most discussed example in the physics literature is the cosmological constant, and that determines the expansion rate of space. So if it is larger, the expansion of the universe will accelerate. If it's much larger than zero and much smaller than zero, it will deaccelerate very rapidly. And so, for example, one of the consequences of that is if it expands too rapidly, there won't be enough time for galaxies and stars to form. So basically, you would just have matter pretty much evenly distributed throughout space, no stars, because there'd be no galaxy, and just hydrogen basically is what you'd be left with, and a little bit of helium.
And this requires a kind of like balance between the cosmological constant and the strength of gravity too, right? Because if it stays at the same sort of strength that it is at in our universe, then if we adjust the cosmological constant, then like you said, the universe is going to expand too big to where gravity can't pull things back together quick enough.
Well, actually, the cosmological constant will swamp any of the effects of gravity. And it's a little, in cosmology, the effect of gravity, how to define the strength of gravity is a really tricky question. So I never talk about the strength of gravity as being the factor in the cosmological context, because if you define the strength of gravity by G, for instance, well, in Planck units, which is a common one used, G is just set to 1. So there is no variation in the strength of gravity. What there is a variation is in what's called the gravitational fine structure constant, which is a dimensionless constant. So when you get to gravity, it's a little tricky in the cosmological context. Because it's gravity plus like the mass of the proton you have to talk about.
Okay, well, yeah, just go ahead and continue sort of where you left off then.
Yeah, so it will expand too rapidly. I mean, that would be under any conditions. And it would, if you got it large enough, and it would contract really fast because its effect rapidly swamps every other effect. So it's typically estimated, it has to be fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 120th power. That's 1 followed by 120 zeros. Another example is the strength of gravity now in a kind of terrestrial context or a context of stars. And then you can talk about adjusting the strength of gravity. And there, if gravity is too strong, the stars will burn too rapidly, and they won't exist long enough to have a reasonable chance of life forming. And then there's other bad things will happen, which you can talk about. So the bottom line, not to go through all the different constants, is there's strengths of the various forces, which affect the strength of gravities. There's a strength of the electromagnetic force. There's cosmological parameters like the cosmological constant. There is masses of various fundamental particles, as mass of the proton or neutron, which are ultimately a result of, they are influenced by the mass of the quarks they're made of, the up and down quark, along with the strength of the strong force between quarks. So there's these fundamental mass, you can think of mass parameters, and then parameters governing the strength of forces, and then quite a few other parameters. And the idea of the fine-tuning for life is that unless they are set in a very small range, life would not be possible. And it's not just carbon-based life. It's any sort of stable, reproducible complexity. So if you go back to the case of the cosmological constant, if the universe expanded so rapidly and galaxies and stars couldn't form, the only elements that would be are elements, hydrogen and other elements formed during the Big Bang, which is basically hydrogen and 25% helium, and that's it. And you just have that distributed fairly evenly throughout the universe. So there wouldn't be any place for stable, reproducible complexity to form, or any energy source to keep the order that such stable, reproducible complexity would need. So it's not just carbon-based life, it's life of any sort of embodied, what I say is embodied, I think the relevant kind of life is embodied conscious agents. And embodied and their bodies have to have a certain amount of stable, reproducible complexity. And so whether they're carbon-based or some other base, that just wouldn't be possible.
Here's something that I think is important to point out. And Josh, I want to get your feedback on this too. So a lot of times apologists will talk about like, we need to explain the fine-tuning data. And I think really what we're trying to explain is why a life-permitting universe exists. We're not trying to explain the fine-tuning data. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, this is a distinction that I see come up. The way that I would tend to think of it is what we're trying to explain is a certain kind of thing that we observe as, like Robin put it, a complex, reproducible structure of some kind. And then the question is, sort of how likely is it that you would get that kind of a thing on one hypothesis versus another? And then the data of the fine-tuning is giving us some reason to think that the probability is really, really low on certain hypotheses. Robin can go into that some more, but like if you don't have any kind of intention aiming towards that.
Yeah, that takes us right into the structure of your version of the argument, which is based on the likelihood principle. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
And so the basic idea behind this, it's a form of broadly Bayesian reasoning. And the broadly Bayesian reasoning goes something like this. It'll give you an example from a courtroom. You know, in a courtroom, let's suppose on the 5th day of testimony, the experts come in and say the DNA and the fingerprints match that of the defendant in, this way, let's say in 10 different ways. And they say that's extremely unlikely if the defendant was where the defendant claimed to be in this, away on a vacation somewhere. Now, it's possible there could have been a match. It could be somebody else has very similar DNA and fingerprints, but very unlikely. So normally a jury would take that as strong evidence in favor of the guilt of the defendant. Why is that? Well, it's because if the defendant is guilty, you would expect the DNA and the fingerprints to match. So it would be likely that they would match, but it'd be extremely unlikely if the defendant was innocent. And so if you want to abstract from that case, you have a piece of evidence, the fingerprints and DNA matching. That's really likely under the guilt hypothesis, very unlikely under the innocent hypothesis, so it strongly confirms the guilt hypothesis over the innocent hypothesis. Now, the fine-tuning argument has the same sort of form. It talks about the existence of a life-permitting universe. Given the fine-tuning evidence that physicists have uncovered, what I was talking about, it is extremely unlikely under the chance hypothesis of all the possible, values, for example, of the cosmological constant, from 0 to 100, from this huge range it can have. It has to be in this small region of 1 part in 10 to the 120th power for complex, embodied conscious agents to exist. That seems extremely unlikely under, if we're just here as a brute fact, we could call that the chance hypothesis. But if there is a God who desired there to be such agents, such as us, it wouldn't be nearly as improbable. And so, because it's far more probable under the God hypothesis than the chance or brute fact hypothesis, it strongly confirms the one over the other. Now, what this kind of line of the likelihood principle, that's the use of the likelihood principles. Evidence confirms the hypothesis it's most likely under, and the strength of the confirmation is equal to the ratio of the two likelihoods. So if it's way, way more likely under the one hypothesis, the guilt hypothesis, for instance, than the innocent, it strongly confirms it. So that's the basic character of the argument. Then you have to fill out two pieces of it. You have to fill out the piece of why do you think it's not surprising under a theistic hypothesis. You have to fill out why you think it's really unlikely under what I call the brute factor, but I actually call it the naturalistic single universe hypothesis, because I'm dealing at first in the argument just with theism versus the idea that there's just a single universe and it's just here as a brute fact. A multiverse I deal with separately. So you have to fill out justify each of those likelihood assignments. And as part of that, you need to be very clear on the kind of probability you're talking about. The kind of probability we're talking about here is what's called epistemic probability and sometimes logical probability. It fits, and sometimes just plausibility. It fits into what's called objective Bayesianism, which actually has gained a lot of ground in the last 20 years. It's used in like particle physics as one of the main ways of analysis and in other areas. And it uses this notion of epistemic probability, which is a measure of different people have different, it could be the measure of plausibility of one hypothesis on another. So, or evidence, how plausible it is, or how much one, let's say, proposition like theism supports the idea that there'd be a life-permitting universe. So it's something in that range of ideas is epistemic probability. It's to be distinguished from particularly statistical probability, which is a measure of proportion in classes. So if I say
how often something happens.
Yeah, how often something happens. Or more like, you could think of it that way. Usually, if you think of it how often it happens, they have to do infinite long runs, so which don't really exist in the world. So it's actually a quite problematic notion. Or you can do it when you have finite classes, like if you say the probability of a 25-year-old American male being a smoker is 25%. You might be, if you're talking in terms of statistical probability, you're saying 25% of 25-year-old American males smoke. That's what you're saying. So it's just a statement of proportion in that class.
So I don't know why I forgot your name, Josh. So Josh, help me. What are your thoughts on what he said so far? And is there anything that you would want to add to help clarify or yeah, I want to toss over to you.
Maybe just add another example to illustrate the structure of the reasoning. So I sort of like the example of the pixels on the screen. So when you're seeing the pixels of, well, I guess you're probably seeing the pixels of me, right? But now that could all just be chance, right? And you could ask yourself, well, how, why think it isn't chance? Like, why think that those pixels are generated by a mind, in a specific mind, a mind of Josh Rasmussen, okay? And you can just ask those two questions that are in the argument that Robin just gave. The first question is, well, how probable is it that the pixels would do something like what you're seeing on the hypothesis that Josh Rasmussen is somewhere in the background here? And then compare that with how likely is it that you would see this just by chance, or perhaps on some other hypothesis. And then when Robin talked about the epistemic probability or the plausibility, I think it is helpful to think of this in terms of, given all that you know from your own perspective, ask yourself, how plausible is it that those pixels are doing that just by chance, where Josh Rasmussen is, right? This is all just random, just noise, and just happens to be doing it that. And just ask yourself that, and then you'll have this sort of sense, probably a sense of deep implausibility. And then you can ask yourself, how plausible is it if Josh is behind the scenes? And if the sense is that that's more plausible, then from your own perspective, those two senses give you a reason to think that Josh Rasmussen is behind the scenes.
So Robin, unless you have anything else to add, I'm going to go ahead and start reading out some of these objections.
Well, I would just say a couple things on, maybe I should say how three different things about this. Just to, I think maybe take 5 minutes to fill in a little bit of the argument, because a lot of the objections that you raise are just misunderstandings of the entire argument and what goes into the argument, how each of the premises is justified. So let me just say a few words about that. First of all, some people are like suspicious of epistemic probability, but they shouldn't be, because I think it's actually the primary kind of probability we have, because any other probability, there's probability in a mathematical sense, or in a relative frequency sense. Like if in the relative frequency sense, when you say that it's 1/2 probability a fair coin is going to come up on heads, means that if you tossed it an infinite number of times, then the relative frequency of heads, the number of heads, would approach with 1/2, with almost 100% confidence you should have it's going to approach 1/2. Where in actual practice, we only have finite. We ever always toss a finite number of coins, so like 10 coins in a row. So what does probability mean in that context? It's not just the number of times heads comes up, because it could come up 10 times in a row in your next toss. So there you really end up having to talk about probability in the sense of confidence. When you say that it's like 10 times coming up heads in a row would be about 1 in 1,000, that's a measure of how much confidence you should have in that happening, which is about 1 in 1,000. In other cases, like when you talk about the probability of a theory, like we say, people often say the thesis of common ancestry, that all life descended from a single cell, given the evidence, is very likely to be true. Okay, what's the likelihood there? It's not a relative frequency of many, many universes. This is a unique universe. It's only happened once, right? The life on Earth, you say, the thesis of common ancestry is about Earth, which has only happened once. What you're talking about there is how much confidence we should have in that thesis. And you can give many, many other examples. So you establish that epistemic.
One of the examples I like that you give in your work is the continental drift theory. I think that was that's another really good one.
And that's how it gets justified. So that goes into the justification of it, because people say, well, you can't justify these things unless you have statistics. You run the trial many, many times. Like in the coin case, at least you can get some statistics for it. But in the case like you mentioned, the continental drift case, you can see that is faulty. because I have to get it is. My screen's turned yellow because I have it on a night setting, so it just distracted me for a minute. So all your faces turn more red and yellow. So it's 9:30. It clicks over to that. So in the case of continental drift, it's once again a unique event. So people said, well, there was like one of the major pieces of evidence for it is the animal and plant life about 2 million years ago between Africa and the South America are the same. And then after that, they begin to diverge. So they said, oh, that means good evidence that Africa and the South America were together way back into the past once. Now, why would you think that supports that they were together, the idea of continental drift? Well, if continental drift were false and they weren't together, it'd be very, very unlikely that they would share the same animal and plant life 2 million years ago, and then it began to diverge. So you make that judgment because you think all the possibilities, what you're doing is you're thinking intuitively about all the possibilities. So you kind of got this mental space in your mind of all the possibilities of how the animal and plant life could be, the possibilities of what they could be on the continent of Africa and the continent of South America. And you see there's very, very few of those possibilities in which they're the same. So by chance, it's going to be very unlikely you're going to get them the same like that 2 million years ago. But if the continents were together, it's not very unlikely at all. So you have no statistics to go off of here because the Earth is a unique event. And all you have to go off is this intuitive judgment over that under the chance hypothesis, how improbable it is that of all the space of possibilities, it's a very, very small proportion of them in which they're the same. So the same thing happens in the fine-tuning argument that use that same kind of reasoning, which is basically applying the principle of indifference. The principle of indifference says you should judge the probability of an event occurring by the proportion of the space of possibilities for that event occurring. So another example of the principle of indifference, if you found like a 20-sided die and no one's ever rolled it before, so you find a 20-sided die, what would you think the probability is of it rolling and landing on 3? Think 1 in 20, because there's 20 possibilities and there's only one possibility of it landing where it would land, and there's only one possibility of it landing on 3. So that would be an application of the principle of indifference applied to the constants. If you have this huge range of constants, let's say, and you only have this very small proportion of them, of 1 part in 10 to the 20th for the cosmological constant, then the principle of indifference would tell you the probability is 1 part in 10 to the 120th power. So that's the kind of formally how you get the improbability under chance, then the of this life-permitting universe occurring, then how you get the probability under theism, and you can't get an exact probability, is you appeal to God's goodness. That's what's underlying it. You perceive there's some value in embodied conscious agents. And since God is perfectly good, a perfectly good being, its motivation for acting in one way over another is whether acting in one way is better than acting in another. So the perfectly good being is motivated by creating things that realize value. And so if you perceive a value in there being embodied conscious beings, then that's going to give God, you're going to think God is going to have a good reason to create such beings because God creates in accordance with value. So that's how you get the that it's at least not super improbable under theism.
Anything else to add, Josh, before we move to objections?
I was just going to ask you, Robin, if you would be happy to, when you say God, to even just maybe use a neutral term like a foundational mind that has goodness within it, just sort of make it as inclusive Is it inclusive?
Right. So a foundational mind is fine with me. That's really what I'm talking about here. And
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and goodness is part of it. And I think that if it's an unlimited mind, I follow Swinburne here. If it's perfectly free and it's not bounded, in other words, it's not restricted by some laws of nature or something, it's the ultimate foundation, then goodness can be the only motivation for doing anything, because the good is inherently self-motivating. But we can get to that later. I think it connects with one of the objections.
All right. Well, yeah, let's jump into the objections. And I've sort of categorized these the best that I can. So, again, what I did was I went on Twitter, I went on Facebook, and what I've done is basically copy and paste these objections that I found from atheists. These are real objections. I didn't make these up. I literally copied and pasted them over. And all I did was basically codify them, put them in a sort of organizational type thing that we're going to move through. So these are not straw men. And I also didn't include any names because we're not trying to make fun of anyone. This is really about the ideas. This is about whether or not these objections are good objections to the fine-tuning argument. So the first category is fine-tuning objections, mainly to fine-tuning itself. So the first one is this fine-tuning isn't as narrow as people make believe. That's the whole objection. So Robin, yeah, just your response to that, and then Josh, if you want to jump in.
Well, I mean, there you have to just look to the physical calculations, like in the case of the cosmological constant. There, it's a pretty straightforward calculation for that. It's a very narrow range of possibilities, because usually the cosmological constant, it's the range of possibilities is usually thought to be 0 up to either the Planck scale, and we know what the Planck scale is when you can no longer apply our physical theories, because our physical theories, we don't have a theory of quantum gravity. If you get to the Planck scale, like if you keep increasing the mass of something up to the Planck scale, then like a proton or electron, let's say, increase its mass, at some point, it's going to be the gravity the electron creates is going to be so high that you're going to have to apply general relativity. But on the other hand, the electron being a point particle, it obeys the laws of quantum mechanics. So at that point, unless you have a theory of quantum gravity, our physics will no longer apply. So all of our physical theories are inherently limited by the Planck scale, because we don't have a theory of quantum gravity. And those constants only actually have meaning within that realm. So within that realm, up to the Planck scale is about 10 to the 120th times larger than the actual value of the cosmological constant. We know if it was just fairly straightforward calculations, if it was like 10 times as large, you just wouldn't be able to get galaxy formation. And so that's like 1 part in 10 to the 120th power. So maybe you think, various ways of changing this. Maybe you think that if you change something else, you maybe could increase it by 10-fold and you still get gravity, galaxy formation, but you can only stretch that so far. Let's suppose you could get it up to even 1,000,000 times stronger. You would still have millions 10 to the 6. So you have 10 to the 7th power. That's still peanuts compared to 10 to the 120th power. That would still be 1 part in 10 to the 113th power. That's 1 followed by 113 zeros. So it would still be a very, very fine-tuned situation. So
just to illustrate how narrow that is, I remember seeing you had some analogy of a dart that gets tossed across with the galaxy.
Yeah, and then it would hit like a single atom.
Right. So maybe you could even say where that calculation came from and how you came to that narrow range.
Well, that was just an estimate. I mean, we know it's just a super small number. Yeah. Okay, I think I did the area or something, and from what is it, so many light years away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the examples that I used was I think with the cosmological constant, one part and one to the one part, 10 to the 120th was the calculation. I actually talked to Luke Barnes about this. It would be like getting dealt 20 royal flushes in a row. So that's the sort of improbability that we're.
And somebody else gave me the analogy. You'd pick a book, on a library. It was at Texas A&M. You pick a book out of the Texas A&M library, the chance of doing that, then picking the winning lottery number, and then picking, the winning player in some team, a bunch of different things in a row like that, and all getting them right. And then picking where a single, the letter in a book, a certain word, that special word, the page number it was on in the book, so on and so forth. In other words, it's a really tiny number, unimaginably tiny. Now, there's other cases like the fine-tuning for the entropy. In order to have, galaxies and things like that, entropy has to be incredibly low. And that is just an astoundingly low number. It's 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power for the entropy to be as low as it is. And entropy is the order in the universe. So the order of the mass energy, it's a configuration. And it's called a configuration in phase space. So phase space is the way, it's the physicist's way of representing the various possibilities of the configuration of the mass energy, including its velocity. And that is such a teeny number that if you think about it, one analogy is if you had a piece of paper and you wrote a 1 on it and then the rest zeros, and then you had another piece of paper and you put all zeros on it, then you put it in your super photocopying machine and you kept running those papers and you filled the whole universe with those papers loaded with zeros, and then the 1 in front of all those zeros would be a smaller number than 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power. So you can see that number is just unimaginably small. So those
it's so small,
cases,
it's hard to even think about.
It's hard to even. And then other cases. Now there's some other cases like the fine tuning. People have objected to this sort of thing, and they brought up cases like the fine tuning of gravity, for instance. And there you have an upper bound in star formation, which is mentioned, like Fred Adams, has an article on this. He's an astrophysicist. And then he says, well, you can still get stable stars at work, and there's no real lower bound going down to 0. And here I want to bring up, I think if you add this, a lot of those cases that you could seem to take away some of the fine-tuning, actually the fine-tuning comes back. If you add that it's not just fine-tuned for life, but for life, technology, and science. So in the case of, and you have to look at beyond just star formation, like in the case of gravity, let's suppose you started increasing gravity. The first thing that would happen is the surface force on any planet like ours would increase. So at some point, you then, because of the surface force increasing, you only can increase so much before we would be crushed. So you'd have to then shrink the planet. And at some point, you'd have to shrink it so much that you couldn't have an ecosystem. But long before that happened, something else would happen, is you can only shrink it at, to keep the same surface force, you can only shrink it at the square root of the increase in the strength of gravity. You can just work this out. Or no, you have to shrink it by the same amount as you increase the strength of gravity. So if you keep the same surface force and don't allow the surface force to increase, let's suppose you increase the strength of gravity by 4-fold. That's that number G in Newton's law, or increase it by 4-fold. What will happen there, then you would have to keep the same force of gravity on the surface, decrease the strength of the radius of the planet by 4-fold. But if you do that, you will end up, add the two together, the what's called the gravitational potential energy of the planet will decrease by a factor of 4. And that's really important because if you don't have that gravitational potential energy, you'll lose your atmosphere. So very quickly you would lose your atmosphere. So my point there is there's a technical actually fairly small technical details, is that you're bounded by other considerations that actually make it a lot more narrow.
So here's another objection that's sort of on the same category of fine-tuning objections. Can the fine-tuned variables be altered in conjunction with each other so as to still produce a stable universe? And if not, how do we reach that conclusion?
Well, like in the case of let's suppose you have, in the case of the cosmological constant, and then let's look at a case, a more simple case of, let's say, increasing the mass of the proton. If you increase the mass of the proton, then all the protons will end up decaying to neutrons. What keeps that happening is neutrons are more massive, slightly more massive than protons. So if you increase the mass of the protons decay to neutrons. And then you really can't get, this has been shown in the literature, you really can't get a viable universe. So the cosmological constant and the mass of the proton, those two numbers are independent of each other. No matter what you do with the mass of the proton, it's not going to change the fact that if you increase the cosmological constant too much, the matter will, the space will expand too rapidly for galaxies and stars to form. And no matter what you do with the cosmological constant, it's not going to change anything about whether the mass of the proton, whether the proton will decay into neutrons if it's too massive.
So these are independent.
They're independent. They're for entirely independent reasons. Now, some of them are dependent on each other, like carbon formation is dependent on the ratio of the electromagnetic force strength to the strong nuclear force. Or in very simple cases, the strong nuclear force has to be stronger than the electromagnetic force. So if you start weakening the electromagnetic force and you keep the strong nuclear force the same, then because protons repel each other, the higher atomic number elements will begin to fall apart because the repulsion between the protons will be too great to keep for the strong nuclear force to keep them together. So there, the dependence is on the ratio. If you increase one, you would have to increase the strong nuclear force to compensate for it. So then you just have the fine-tuning there is not those individually, but rather the ratio.
So Josh, I know that this is mainly like on the physics side of things, but do you have anything to add?
Well, just the general idea that you can have some parameters that are dependent on other parameters, but as Robin was pointing out, it doesn't follow that you don't have other parameters that are independent, and all you need is really even just one parameter that would be unlikely. And then if you add more and more parameters, then you're going to decrease the likelihood depending on how dependent they are, right? So a lot of this comes in degrees. And the other thing I wanted just to add in is, and Robin, you're swimming in the physics, so I'm actually curious to hear you confirm this or speak to this. But when I was in college, I first heard of these lists of fine-tuning parameters, and the lists weren't very long. There were like maybe 12 or 15, somewhere around there. And then over the years, the list kept getting longer and longer. And I had an astronomer friend tell me that every month there's new parameters coming out that have to be finely tuned, and maybe they're dependent on some other ones, but that the degree of fine tuning seems to be more and more the more we find out about what it takes. And I wonder if that's true. Is that true, Robin?
I wouldn't say the list is, some people, there's somebody who promotes some of this stuff has these huge long lists, and a lot of those just aren't well worked out. So I don't think the list is getting longer in that way. What I do think is in most cases we're finding out more about it's not that the number of parameters is increasing. First of all, there's only so many fundamental parameters, and there's maybe even 12 we can actually do significant calculations on. I think it's even probably less than that. So if I were to put a guess, and I have to go back and look at it, say maybe 9. There's 9 that are fine-tuned for life. There's other ones fine-tuned for scientific discovery, but there's maybe about 9 that are fine-tuned for life. So it's smaller than that. But what we find is there's additional reasons. I think the general trend has been there's been additional reasons we find for why something has to be fine-tuned. But I'm sure that's quite disputed. And so I think that statement would be quite controversial, because others would say, oh, some of them we thought were fine-tuned. We can find alternatives of how complexity could occur. But even if that's true, there's still enough, like you said, that remain that are highly fine-tuned.
Or that it's maybe clearer than it was, that at least the fine-tuning, the sort of evidence that there are parameters, at least that's clear, even if the number of parameters hasn't increased among the fundamental ones.
Yeah, see, I would just say what happened with me when in 2003, I wrote a essay, 6 Good Cases of Fine-Tuning. And at that point, I looked through a lot of the literature and found physical errors in their calculation. So there was only 6 that I found convincing. Then I then began to question even some of those, that there might be alternatives. It wasn't until like 2010 I started looking at this larger issue of science and technology. And then when you added that in there, you just didn't have very much wiggle room left. So then there was a lot more reasons for the fine-tuning, and things got even a lot more narrow.
All right, so let's move on, because we've covered 2 objections and we have 20 on the list. I don't think we're going to get through all of them, but I want to try to get through as many as we can. The next one is in this category is physical necessity. So this one is we don't have a complete description of the laws of nature. So it is very well possible that the constants have the values they do because of physical necessity, as some have been shown to already. It could be a brute fact that the laws of nature are what they are.
I don't know if any constant's been shown to has been shown to be a result of physical necessity, but there was a hope in the 80s of finding a grand unified theory, the final theory, in which not only would give you the mathematical form of the laws of nature, but based on internal consistency conditions within the theory itself, would actually give you the value of the parameters. A lot of that hope centered around, at the time, superstring theory, but then to a lot of the people promoting that idea's chagrin, it was found that superstring theory actually allowed an enormous number of different possibilities, was not near as restrictive as they thought. So let's suppose you did find there was a deeper theory that entailed just the values of the constants we have now. It would still be, there would still be this fine-tuning now at the level of the deeper theory. Why that deeper theory, which entails the gravitational constant G, the cosmological constant, just fall within this very small range that permits life instead of all the other possibilities. So now you've just kicked the problem up to that the universe is governed by that grand unified theory instead of some other mathematical structure that would give you different values. So I don't think that's going to be a very good objection. It's a little bit, if you want to give an analogy, let's suppose I, go up to the mountains and the rocks are arranged in the formation underneath the mountains, the cliff that says, "Welcome to the mountains, Robin Collins." And I say, "Oh, that's good evidence. My brother was up here and arranged them and welcomed me to the mountains." And I've got one of these skeptics come along and say, "Oh, no. there is maybe a grand unified theory that entails that all the particles were just in the right configuration at the beginning of the universe, such that when this earthquake occurred, that caused a minor earthquake there, and were just such that it caused all the rocks to fall into that position. I would say, okay, that could be the case, but that would be enormously improbable that whatever the grand unified theory that entailed the initial conditions of the universe would entail it to give that configuration of rocks versus all the other possibilities. So I wouldn't allow it to undermine my reasoning that it was likely my brother was up there. And if you did allow that, it's going to undermine all your reasoning. That's how I generally respond to that.
What's your thoughts, Josh?
Well, there's also a different form of fine-tuning argument where it's chance, physical necessity, or design. And so this objection might be focused on that other version. So it's saying, oh, well, maybe it is physical necessity. Whereas it's harder to see how exactly would target Robbins or the Bayesian formulation. I mean, we could think about, okay, let's say that it was physically necessary. But then, one sort of analogy similar to Robbins would be, imagine that the stars are arranged in this pattern that say, I'm Lord who made the universe such that the foundational physically necessary aspects of the universe are going to unfold to generate this arrangement. Then we could ask, well, what is the epistemic probability that it would be physically necessary that the universe would take that form on chance? And my thought is that you still have a Bayesian argument here, because you can still, this is a different form of the argument. So this is why I think that objection might be, it's almost like we have to separate objections and see, okay, which argument is it targeting? And I'm not seeing that it would target this Bayesian form of the argument.
Well, I think the key here, it's epistemic probability that you're dealing with. And so even if it was necessary, it's still epistemically very improbable that there would be that physical necessity versus all the others. And if you don't do it in terms of epistemic probability, anybody could raise that objection about any improbable occurrence in any inference you made.
Yeah, so this objection is still along the same lines. It's basically, we don't know if the constants could be otherwise. So it's another way of saying we don't know that it's not physically necessary.
Right, and that's irrelevant to the argument. It's not about it's about epistemic possibility, not physical possibility.
And I want to just add, it can help to even just think of this from the side of reason, because I think when you think of it from the side of science, it's almost like you're behind this wall of having to like trust what the experts are figuring out, which is cool. But as a philosopher, I want to sort of see what I can see from the armchair if I could do it. And so when I think about, what does it take to have a universe in which there's anything sort of interesting and complex? And one time I had this project, it was a research project where I created a computer program to simulate a world with creatures that would then evolve and multiply in the program. And it was very interesting creating the code for this program, because I had to make a lot of decisions. I had to like set a lot of dials and parameters to first get the program to run, but then to specify a world where there was any interesting complexity that could even get an evolution started. And I've sort of thought of this computer program as a way of exploring the conceptual terrain, putting the physics aside, because it's sort of hard to see this. I mean, you could sort of think of it from your armchair and think, okay, what's a possible reality? Here's one. There is just one simple thing, and it's blue, and that's it. Okay? There's no complex creatures in that reality. Here's another one. There's motion of things, and they're all just scattering out forever and ever and ever. Again, no complex reproducing creatures in that one. And this is what I found. I mean, this was confirmed in the computer program, that you have to get a lot of very specific things in order to get any kind of interesting complexity within all conceptual space. And so there's this other kind of argument from reason. I think that maybe you could think of like two witnesses, reason and science together, point to a narrowness of the range.
Okay, so let's move on to the next category, and this one is Douglas Adams' Puddle analogy, which surprisingly was one of the main objections that popped up on Twitter. I say surprisingly because, well, anyways, let me just give it to you. So, and this is actually a quote from Douglas Adams. It says, "Imagine a puddle waking up one morning and thinking, this is an interesting world I find myself in, an interesting hole I find myself in, fits me rather neatly, doesn't it? In fact, it fits me staggeringly well. Must have been made to have me in it." That's the whole quote. And this is supposed to just completely debunk the fine-tuning argument.
I mean, if I'm trying to understand, I looked at that objection, trying to understand what the objection is getting at. If you say, well, everything is arranged just for me in particular, let's say you said that. Let's suppose it's kind of, I think this is sort of argument. I could say, well, it's very improbable, all, the genetics and everything for me to have existed at all. And therefore there must be a God because how improbable it is. That wouldn't be a very good line of reasoning, because in order to use the likelihood principle, you also have to it has to be much more likely under the other hypothesis, let's say in this case, the theistic hypothesis. So if you're looking at the puddle and this just particulars of the whole, why would God create that particular whole versus all the others? So it's very improbable there'd be that particular whole under theism also. Just like it's still very improbable that me, the body with this particular set of genetics, would exist versus all the others. That's both improbable under theism and not theism. So that's why you can't infer God exists. If you toss a coin 1,000 times in a row and it comes up in some configuration, some random configuration. Well, any random configuration is very, very improbable, whatever it comes up in, heads, tails, right, in that configuration. But you can't infer that God exists because that configuration's also going to be very improbable under theism. And so in this puddle case, it would only work it'd only be a good analogy if
that was the argument.
God had a reason to produce a strong reason to produce that particular kind of whole. If there was some great value in that particular kind of whole versus all the other kinds of whole, then you would have a good argument going. Why that particular whole versus the others? But otherwise, you don't have an argument because it's not even analogous, because there's no good argument for thinking that's God would have a good reason for producing that particular whole. So I don't get how that argument's supposed to work.
Or how it's even relevant.
It's even relevant.
Think about it going back to I think, Josh, maybe this is what you were going to do is go back to Robbins' original explication and form of the argument. Which premise does this attack?
Or target.
Yeah.
Sort of a battle. Now, I was actually going to say that. I mean, one thing that I like about objections is that they're tools for testing and clarifying arguments. And I think sometimes when we're talking about these kinds of arguments, it can kind of get into sort of this battle mode where it's like people are fencing and trying to win the argument. But I find it very helpful to think of them as tools to clarify. And so I was reflecting on, okay, what is good about this objection? What is it getting right? And I thought maybe what it's getting right is that there can be sometimes a selection effect worry where you are getting data that is confirming a hypothesis, but you couldn't get any data that disconfirms. So the idea would be we shouldn't be surprised to find that the conditions are suitable for our existence, that the universe is just right, finely tuned, whatever it takes for us to exist, because we couldn't have observed otherwise. If it weren't set up for us to exist, we wouldn't exist, so we couldn't observe that it didn't wasn't fit for our existence. And so there's sort of this selection effect. And this maybe then could target so which premise, right, does it target in the argument? I mean, I think what Robin was saying was right, because you still have the premise that, okay, well, the fact that there's a universe in which there's beings without a design explanation or a foundational mind, that's going to be, let's say, surprising. But there's this sharpshooter analogy that kind of helps to illustrate why you can still have a good argument, even if you observe your non-existence. So the idea is, imagine you have a bunch of people and they're aimed to shoot you to death. It's just sort of a sad day. And, ready, aim, fire. They're all sharpshooters. They've never missed before. And there's like 30 of them lined up, right? And fire, and then you notice, you observe you're still alive. And you're like, what? How did this happen? And you're wondering, what explains this? Well, in this case, you couldn't have observed you're not being alive. If they had destroyed you, you wouldn't have observed that, let's say. So, and yet it does seem right to say that you should be surprised, because it's still more likely that you are surviving if they sort of missed on purpose, or there's some intention behind that, than if they all just missed by chance.
So it confirms the purpose hypothesis. You'd go away thinking they, you'd go away from that circumstance thinking that they did not plan on shooting you.
Right. You wouldn't just think about a puddle and think, well, that puddle couldn't exist unless the hole was fit for it, and I couldn't have survived unless
right.
by chance. Right.
So the argument, it just gives us one thing with that objection is it throws out something without really clarifying what the argument is. So it needs to go, okay, like you said, what premise is it attacking? Exactly what is the argument? What are they appealing to? Are they saying there's a selection effect here? Then what is the selection effect, and how does it undermine the argument?
Okay, the next one is, who created God? If God designed the universe, then who designed God?
Oh, I just have to say, Robin, this was my question to you when I was a computer science major. I sent you an email because you were the world expert on the fine-tuning argument, and this was my question. Do you remember what you said in response? You had
well, I've actually got a little simpler response now than I had then. Mm-hmm. So let me give the simpler response. So I reword that objection. It's like, okay, there's this fine tuning that needs to be explained, right? So it's that things are just adjusted just right for life. So what the objection is getting at is, wouldn't God have to be extremely fine tuned in order to exist and create a universe? So let's suppose let's suppose we find out life is very improbable, to come about, let's say, in anywhere. It's very improbable, as an analogy. It's very, very improbable for a single cell to arise by chemical evolution, let's say. So I say, oh, here's my solution. There's extraterrestrials. They came and they arranged the DNA just right, and that's how we got here. But then the same problem arises for them. How could, by chance, if you're just appealing to them and you don't go further, how did they get here? Wouldn't it be very improbable for those extraterrestrials to exist? So if we need explanation, because it seems very improbable for us to arise by chance, they're going to be just as much in need of explanation. So they try to do the same thing in the case of God. The difference here is, in the case of God, classical theists have always held that God, for independent reasons, not because they knew the fine-tuning evidence, that God is not composed of parts. So the fine-tuning is a matter of, when you think something needs fine-tuning, it has a bunch of parts that has to be arranged and just right in order to do whatever it does. Like a watch, all the parts have to be arranged just right in order to function. But God is partless. So there's nothing to fine-tune in the case of God. God either is or is not. So it's what they call a red herring. It's an objection that just doesn't understand classical theism. Now, you might think that if you've tried to redo the objection, you would say, well, this idea of a partless being, like God, a consciousness that's partless, is not coherent. That would be a different objection. But as long as it's coherent, then there is no fine-tuning necessary, so it doesn't kick the problem up one level. You can also see that like a picture, of Abraham Lincoln. If you had a bunch of mold growing in the back of your roommate's refrigerator that looked like the picture of Abraham Lincoln, you wouldn't just accept that was there by chance. The reason is because it has parts, different pieces of it, that have to be arranged just right in order to get the picture of Abraham Lincoln. So you demand an explanation. That's what the universe is like. But God is not like that. God doesn't have those parts. It has to be arranged just right. So that would be the general way I'd respond to that objection.
So Josh, what do you do now when you, well yeah, just go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add Robin's email response to me back, way back when I first asked him this as a computer science major, just to add that even if God is complex, it was kind of interesting, Robin. I don't know if you remember this, but you said that one of the properties of minds is that they produce complexity. And if you have sort of this infinite mind, there's no real limit to how much complexity it could produce by infinite. What I mean is that doesn't have these arbitrary limits or boundaries.
Right.
And so that even if it had some kind of complexity of some sort, maybe it could still produce more complexity because it would like never stop producing.
Right. It generated its own internal complexity.
Yeah, or just internal or external.
Right.
However you want to go. But the idea was that minds are just the kind of thing that can keep producing complexity. So there's no sort of problem with, I think is the worry that I had at that time was if you're trying to explain complexity, which I understand that that's not all that's being explained here, you don't want the foundation of things to be more complex.
Right.
Than what you're trying to explain.
So you're trying to explain fine tuning. That's what you're really trying to explain.
Yes.
And that requires a bunch of why this alternative configuration versus another. Now, if you can dig in a little deeper in that argument, maybe I should say a few more words about it because there is a legitimate intuition behind it. And the idea is the blueprint for what is produced has to be at least as complex as the thing produced. So then you might think the blueprints in God's mind has to be more complex, or at least as complex as the universe. And if God only had one blueprint in God's mind, then you would have to have just the right blueprint to get this universe. But in the case of God, God has all possible blueprints. And so there's no need to explain why this blueprint that gives you a universe for life exists versus all the others. Because in God's mind are all the blueprints. And then it's because of God's goodness, God selects this blueprint to be actual.
So Josh, what's your stock response nowadays to why God is not a sort of created or designed being?
Okay. Well, so, I mean, I do think God has necessary existence, so that would be a reason. But my updated response when I think about this specific objection about who designed God is to make a distinction between the intrinsic probability of the hypothesis and versus let me put it this way. The intrinsic probability of a hypothesis is going to be improved, I think, if it doesn't have many different independent parts. So if it's simpler. And I think that's really what's relevant. So it's not so much the complexity of the being. So for example, just to draw this out a little bit, if you have this hypothesis that there's just a perfect being, okay, that hypothesis is relatively simple. It's not as complex as setting up all the different dials as the foundational theory. But from that hypothesis, one could perhaps tease out some kind of complexity. Maybe, as Robin was pointing out, in terms of it, maybe an internal blueprint, or we could think about that. But that's a further thought, and it's not relevant to the intrinsic probability of the hypothesis itself. And so this is why, in ordinary reasoning, when we're thinking about, okay, is there a mind behind these pixels, for example, we don't have to first figure out, but wait a minute, like, would the mind be at least as complex as the thing being explained? It's not really about that. What we have is a relatively simple hypothesis that there's a mind, and then that makes way more likely the effect. So that's kind of how I've been thinking about it lately. But this is all interconnected with what Robin just said about the material parts. You don't have to get all these material parts within a narrow, finely tuned range in order for God to exist. And fundamentally, I do think that is the difference here.
And you don't have to have just the right blueprint because it's
Yes.
all the blueprints. That's why, I mean, as analogy for the atheist side, if you believe all possible realities were actual, then you would have an explanation because all blueprints would exist. And there wouldn't need to be an explanation for it. It wouldn't cry out for explanation the same way that all blueprints exist. There'd be nothing fine-tuned about that. And then they would say, well, the reason there's a life-permitting universe is because many of them are life-permitting because they all exist. And that goes into, the kind of extreme version of the multiverse hypothesis. And that one you get an analogous explanation because all possibilities exist. You don't get a fine-tuning at that level.
But you have to fine-tune even that explanation a little bit, because if you say all possibilities, here's one, there's a blue sphere and nothing else. Here's another one. There's more.
Yeah, but then there's the selection effect of, so you actually do have to fine tune it to get other features of our universe besides just observers.
Yes.
Why we're not just we observe an orderly universe, for instance.
Well, even just to avoid contradictions, because if it's a possible reality that there's a blue sphere with nothing else, and another possible reality where there's more than just one blue sphere, those two realities can't both be actual because they contradict each other.
Well, they could be actual space-time and David Lewis's sense of their actual space regions of space-time, enclosed regions. One's only blue, and
right.
So
I said if there was a blue ball and nothing else in any other.
Yeah. But these possible realities thought of in this way are, self-enclosed regions of space-time.
I don't want to get too far off track here. I want to keep moving through these objections. I mean, these are all really interesting discussions, but this one is basically that the universe is hostile. And here's the objection: most of the universe is hostile for life, and earlier in life, oxygen was toxic to us, so we evolved to fit our environment, yet still fight to survive. That's the objection.
I don't quite see how the latter part of it's relevant, because it's about the whole argument's about how probable it is under theism versus the naturalistic single universe hypothesis of a universe being such that it can produce stable reproducible complexity of the kind needed for embodied conscious agents. So, but they might be saying on the first part of the argument, there seems to be objection of the universe being hostile towards life. Well, that depends on whether you think that, an all good God would want to have a universe cram full of life, like the more the better within the universe, than not. And I see no reason to think that. I don't see no reason to think that you would expect under theism, the universe would be crammed full of life than not. They would have to argue, and within the premises of the argument, if they're trying to undermine the first premise that it's likely under theism or not surprising under theism there would be a life-permitting universe, they would have to argue that you would expect God, if God was going to create a universe with life, one that is chock full of life. But maybe God wants other body conscious beings, but they could be in other universes, as far as we know. Maybe there's a lot of other universes or realities God created. So I don't see what premise that is supposed to undermine, except the first one. Then there needs to be an argument for why you think that it'd be, God would be far more likely to create a universe chock full of life than not.
Anything to add, Josh?
One thing, I think it is helpful to kind of think of different weights, different evidence as different weights. And so you could think of the fine-tuning as sort of one weight of a reason. If you think that the probability of getting life is more likely on theism than on chance, that would be one weight of reason. But you could have the intuition or the sort of the sense that on theism, it does seem more surprising that the universe isn't completely filled with life than on life, especially if we're thinking in terms of epistemic probability. Think of it from your perspective. How surprising is it from your perspective? And I think, and I want to just say this because I think it's empowering for people to kind of put themselves in the sort of the driver's seat and own their own evaluation of the argument, and not push it off to sort of experts to say, how likely things are, or how likely we think they are. I mean, it could be you just think about it and you think, yeah, I think if God were real, there'd be there wouldn't be black holes. Like that just seems God, God wouldn't do that, right? And so if you think that, if you have that sense, if you think that black holes are more likely without God than with God, that doesn't undermine the fine-tuning argument, but that would be another weight then to put into the balance of weight.
It basically lowers your epistemic probability of there being this kind of universe under theism, but it doesn't lower it near enough to make it such that theism is not confirmed, because it'd have to lower it so much that it would be no more likely under theism to get this kind of universe than it is just under the brute fact hypothesis. But it's so incredibly unlikely under the brute fact hypothesis, it would have to lower it a huge amount. In other words, you would have to be virtually convinced that if God were going to create a universe that had life, it would be chock-full.
Yeah, so we have a guy that's currently in the live chat, and he's been raising this objection. It looks like almost all night. His name is Dave Langer. He says, and it's actually in line with what we've been talking about. It says, why would God create this huge universe and have barely any life in it? Makes no sense.
Well, it depends on what God's purposes are. And as a matter of fact, if you think that, maybe there is a lot of life elsewhere. We don't know. I mean, maybe there is other beings like us on Andromeda Galaxy, and because there's many, many other galaxies. So maybe if you really did think that, what the conclusion to draw is, if you believed in God, that there is a lot of life throughout the universe. In fact, I think myself that the existence of extraterrestrial life is so improbable, just on that, the single first cell could develop and be reproducing under a chance hypothesis, that it's extremely unlikely under chance there'd be extraterrestrial life. But I think if you believe in God, I actually expect maybe there will be other life in other galaxies and stuff. So we have no evidence right now, one way or another, whether that's the case. So let's suppose that's right. God would do it that way. It makes no sense. And you just should think that there is life in other galaxies. That's the way you should go.
Yeah, that's. I was going to say the same thing. If you check for yourself, how surprising is it that there would be no life, right, on theism? And if you think, well, yeah, that's so surprising, then you could think of the fine-tuning argument as evidence for life throughout the universe.
What I think is, we're not the only embodied conscious beings. I think there's many, many others. It might not be in this universe. It could be other universes. So I share a kind of similar intuition. It isn't just 5 billion human beings that they're only bodied conscious agents that God ever created in all eternity. That doesn't seem intuitively to make a lot of sense to me. So I basically agree with that intuition, but I just conclude there's probably a lot of other beings that I know nothing of.
All right, let's move on. This one is, the universe seems fine-tuned for black holes. There's so much black holes in the universe, it seems the universe is fine-tuned for black holes.
Okay, well so you could let's suppose you tried to run a fine-tuning argument for black holes. You'd say everything has to be adjusted just right in the universe in order for black holes to exist. So you have to just the right values of the constant. Let's suppose you could get that going. So then there's a fine-tuning for black holes. But then in order to have any kind of argument for anything, you would have to have another hypothesis under which it wasn't unlikely it would be fine-tuned for black holes. But you don't have that. So they'd have two things they'd have to fill in, just the equivalent of the actual fine-tuning argument. They'd have to fill in that parameters and various things had to be adjusted just right for black holes. And then they'd have to have another argument they would fill in that, let's say, God designed the universe for black holes. And then they'd have to argue that in all good God, that there's some great good realized by there being black holes. And hence, we conclude that God designed the universe for black holes, or whatever their other explanation for why their black holes are.
Well, here's a possible hypothesis. So you have a being, maybe it's not God, maybe it's just someone else who likes black holes.
Yeah, but then why would it like black holes versus everything else? It's like explaining, somebody wins a lottery oh, the lottery commissioner rigged it for that person. But in order for that to work, because it's so unlikely, like it was a million, a 10 million ticket lottery and a single person wins, one hypothesis is that it was the lottery commissioner rigged it in favor of that person that won. But why would the lottery commissioner rig it in favor of that person that won versus all the other people that bought tickets? So that probability is going to be really low, unless you can find some connection between who won and the lottery commissioner. Let's suppose the lottery commissioner's sister won. Then it would count as evidence that it was rigged in favor of, his sister.
That's interesting. Josh, what are your thoughts on that? Would you say, because it almost seems like we're talking about a theory that's more complicated when you add something like this being cares about this. That seems to make the theory more complicated, and maybe that's what's sort of driving the lower prior probability of the theory.
I think if you build in the effect into the hypothesis, you lower the prior probability of the effect of the hypothesis. But I do think if it was a live option, given the data you had, that the person, let's say Susie wins the lottery, and you've heard a rumor that Susie's dad is in charge of the lottery. Well, now the prior probability, given your background knowledge and that rumor, is going to make it less surprising in that case. But you need this extra information, right? I think that's Yes.
So it's not just the complexity; it's that there's all these alternatives that are sort of equally probable for the lottery commissioner. That the lottery commissioner, there's no reason, there's no, it was Jane Berkowitz who won, let's say, and there's no special connection between the lottery commissioner and Jane Berkowitz. Why her versus Robin Collins or Josh Rasmussen? All the other people, you should weight them equally probable, and then you get a very low probability of it being Jane Berkowitz. On the other hand, if Jane Berkowitz is a sister, then you've got a special reason why the lottery commissioner would rig it in favor of that. So it's no longer equally probable. The principle of indifference no longer applies. And so there's a probability goes way up.
All right, let's keep moving on here. So the next one is not certain, therefore it fails. Basically, the tiny chance that it happened naturally means that we can't be certain that God caused it.
That's right. That's true.
Yep, that's true. I say that's true, but correct. That's true. That's likelihood principle. Bayesian reasoning only tells you that the evidence counts in favor of one hypothesis over another. It doesn't tell you that you can be sure that the hypothesis is true.
Yeah, so this is just not an objection.
Yeah, it could be I toss a coin 100 times in a row and it all comes up heads. I conclude the coin's weighted. Well, under the non-weighted hypothesis, it's possible it would come up heads 100 times in a row. But I think I'm going to go with the weighted hypothesis because it's so unlikely under the other one, but not unlikely under the weighted one.
I just wanted to add something about the value of this objection, because again, there's a lot of different arguments that are called design arguments. And one thing I've noticed from just teaching is that when students would sometimes express a design argument, and their sort of initial form of it will be something like, well, there's all this complexity, and therefore there had to be a designer. And that had to be is like a kind of certainty, right? And so if that's the argument, right, then all you have to do to undermine that argument is to point out that, well, it doesn't follow from the data that the conclusion is certain.
Right.
So that version of the design argument doesn't seem to go through. But of course, it doesn't follow that this sort of Bayesian version is a problem, because in fact, the Bayesian version predicts that you're not going to have certainty. It's just probability. Yes.
All right, moving on. This one is God of the gaps. The fine-tuning argument falls squarely under the argument from incredulity or divine fallacy. That's the first time I've heard that one. Basically, this fallacy is an assertion that because you cannot understand or imagine another way to do it, you insert God as the answer in this case, God of the gaps.
Yeah, it's a judgment of probability, not because you can't understand another way of doing it. And historically, God of the gaps is an attempt to explain processes in the world that you couldn't explain. Let's say spots, earthquakes, disease, whatever it was, by invoking God as the explanation instead of a natural process. And I think a good analogy to see the differences is a clock analogy. Let's suppose there's little beings on in a clock. And they want to know why the hands move the way they do, and why and if I do this, the alarm goes off. Well, the scientific explanation of that would be, in terms of, we're talking about old-fashioned clocks here, the gears and springs and things like that in the clock. Okay, and so if you invoked some being and said, "Oh, it's some being shoved the hands this way and that way," that would be a kind of God of the gaps explanation. But it'd be a perfectly appropriate. It wouldn't be a God of the gaps explanation if you said, well, why is there a clock at all? And why does it have this structure? Then you would have to invoke something outside of the clock. Namely, human beings, they had these purposes for creating a clock like this, that in order to tell time, wake them up in the morning, and so forth. So likewise with the universe, we're not invoking God to explain some process within the universe. It's why there's this universe at all, and why does it have this structure?
I like that analogy a lot. What are your thoughts, Josh?
I have nothing to add. Thought it was good.
Okay. All right, let's keep chugging along. So that one was relatively easy to answer. No need for God. A fine-tuned universe is one that doesn't need a God to exist.
It could exist within the fine-tuning argument itself. If you don't appeal to other arguments like cosmological argument, you could say, yeah, the universe could have existed without a God. It's just extremely unlikely, just like the coins could have all landed on heads if they weren't weighted in favor of heads. That's possible, but very unlikely. So it's evidence, in the case of the coins, that the coins were weighted in favor of heads, that they all landed on heads, 100 times in a row. Likewise, the universe being structured the way it is, so it could have existed on its own. The fact that it's so improbable is evidence for the existence of God.
Yeah, you have 200 royal flushes being dealt to you in a row, and you're like, well, I don't need the cheating hypothesis, right? So therefore we should reject the cheating hypothesis. That's a really... Anyways, what are your thoughts, Josh?
Yeah,
Anything to add?
I just want to add, I think sometimes it can help. I don't know, I kind of like to use that term foundational mind, just because that term God has variation in meaning in people's minds. And I think that probably for some people, the prior probability of God is so low, or it feels so ad hoc, or it's associated with things that are very implausible.
Or maybe an outdated way of thinking, unscientific.
Yeah, which makes it so that the kind of evidence that you need, I guess if somebody's saying, well, you don't need this hypothesis, to me, that's reflecting the thought that I need the hypothesis to believe it. Do you know what I mean?
I want to just say something about, because I 100% agree with you on that. Because you think of a God out there, like this external being, that's behind the God of the gaps instead of a foundational mind. And as I see it, theism's about this ultimate question. Is you go back as far as you do, are things ultimately impersonal, and so unconscious? Is that the ultimate foundation? Or as you go far as you back, is consciousness primary, consciousness and will? And there's a fundamental choice to make there metaphysically, which is ultimate. Theism asserts consciousness and will are ultimate. That's the ultimate foundation, whereas the other side asserts that it's something impersonal. So when really you're talking about a God explanation, you're saying it's in terms of, if we hypothesize consciousness and will are fundamental, then we get an explanation of this.
Yes, it's not this radically different kind of reality.
Yeah, or reality of God out there, like a super being out there somewhere.
And it's not like this mysterious other. It's like, well, it's actually consciousness. We know what that is. So
right, and we're just saying it's foundational to everything. Mind is foundational, not the impersonal.
All right, let's move on. Let me pull up my sheet here. So this one is I've labeled it as the gap problem, and that applies, I guess, to cosmological arguments more generally. How does the fine-tuning argument get us to the classical conception of God? What makes us think that the cause of the universe really is God and not some impersonal deity?
Okay, so here I would say you have to have, if you're going to explain the fine-tuning, it has to be under your basic conception of God. God has to have a reason to bring about the fine-tuning. And it can't be an arbitrary reason. It has to be a reason that's somehow connected deeply in to God, that God's other attributes. So goodness provides that reason. And why is goodness so important? You might say, well, isn't that an arbitrary attribute? Why have God good versus God indifferent? Well, first of all, an indifferent God's not going to do it, because it'll give you no reason why God would create a fine-tuned universe versus all the other possibilities. So your goodness is going to be better than indifference. But why would a being like God have to be all good? Well, here I think, this is Swinburne's kind of argument, I think it's right on, is the good is the only property that is self-motivating. I mean, this is a thesis going back to Plato. Why don't people do good? It's either because they're ignorant of the good, or because they have some countervailing desire. Because if you recognize something as good, that itself gives you a motivation for bringing it about. No other properties like that. If you recognize something is round, that gives you no motivation for bringing it about. Maybe the only other property about like that is beauty, but beauty and goodness are very closely connected. So if you think there is such a thing as goodness, there is a property of some things are better than others. God is omniscient, then God would have a non-arbitrary reason for bringing about things that have value, both aesthetically and morally. And so then you have a positive reason for why you would have a being that is good, and you would want that being to have all knowledge, all power, because if you start limiting that being, then you have to have something like some set of laws which would to determine its limits. And then you'd have to have an explanation for those laws. Like, why can't, if God could create centaurs but couldn't create unicorns, then you'd have to have some explanation. But why does God have the power to create centaurs but not the power to create unicorn? What's restricting God? Like you'd have, well, I can walk out the door, but I can't jump over the building. Well, then you'd have an explanation in terms of my physical structure, but you'd have to appeal to something else. So then you'd have to now have to explain that set of laws that's restricting God, and God would no longer be an ultimate explanation. So your ultimate explanation is going to need to be unlimited. And if it's an unlimited mind, consciousness, it can't be indifferent, because if it perceives something as of moral value, that's going to give a motivation for bringing it about. And once you have that, then you've got an explanation for the fine-tuning. So that's the entire line of reasoning.
What do you think, Josh?
Well, it's interesting hearing you spell that out, Robin, because it sounds very familiar. I mean, in my own work, I've come at it from the argument from contingency for a necessary foundation. And then I thought about, okay, what kind of foundation would this be? And I think, okay, we want to shave off arbitrary limits, because otherwise they would need some sort of deeper explanation. And I end up coming to the same conclusion, that it's going to be this supreme being that has the good, the power, including the powers of knowledge. And so it's going to be personal. And so that gets the same result from another angle. But it's also interesting for me to think about, like, which principles are we appealing to that are properly part of the fine-tuning argument, and which ones are properly part of stage 2 of an argument from contingency. And that's just sorting or how to label the arguments. But
yeah,
I think it is helpful to divide the arguments and to think about, okay, well, if the fine-tuning argument gets us a foundational mind, that can bring people together into a further investigation of, okay, well, let's see if we can tease out what kind of a mind is this. Is it evil? Does it have arbitrary limits? Does it depend on other laws? That would push the fine-tuning back. So, I mean, and I just want to emphasize that I think it is helpful and useful to separate phases and stages of arguments, because you don't have to walk through every step of every argument to see a significant result just coming out of the fine-tuning argument.
Right, the fine-tuning argument confirms that kind of being, but doesn't just itself, as the evidence from fine-tuning, doesn't itself exclude other explanations. It would also make the existence of a fine-tuned universe not improbable. Then you have to go look at those, what would be required of a good explanation. So that's a further step that goes beyond the mere fine-tuning evidence itself.
Yes, and so then when we're bringing in sort of all the data to build our large-scale theory, you can start thinking about, okay, there's consciousness, there's fine-tuning, there's reasoning, there's all these different, this sense of right and wrong, and then you think, okay, well, how well does the foundational mind hypothesis predict those things? And then, of course, we have to think about suffering and evil, and so this is why I do think it's very helpful to kind of think of these different weights, so that you can recognize weights that can lead you to a conclusion, even if you're not fully convinced, and it can lead you into further investigation, rather than thinking of it as an all or nothing. Because if you think of it as all or nothing, then you start getting into this battle mode where you come up with these like terms like, oh, that's a fallacious, like we don't need an all-powerful perfect being, by that data point. It's like, yeah, I mean, we don't need that, right? But it can be a weight that can lead us into a direction.
So what you're trying to do is the objector getting into their mind and seeing what's good about the objection.
Yes.
Where the objection is right, what is the insight, and then tease that out to move things forward.
Yes, and what's good about the objector, like seeking truths and recognizing, I think it takes a mature mind to recognize some weights of evidence against the view you have.
Right.
And that's part of truth seeking and truth finding.
Okay, so let's move on. We have about 15 minutes left, and there's just a couple that we're going to get through, I think, tonight, but this one is one that pops up every now and then. It's basically in the category of God doesn't need to do any fine-tuning. And it goes like this: God doesn't need to fine-tune the universe to create life, therefore it isn't an argument for God. God could create and sustain life no matter what the nature of the universe and its constants.
So I suppose God could, just by a continual set of miracles, keep life going, and there wouldn't be any underlying laws of nature that did that. So
my question is, how is that at all different from what the theist sort of already believes about what's happening with God constantly sort of sustaining existence and keeping the laws of nature into play? Why isn't it not just, why isn't the universe described by complete chaos? Like, it seems like it's almost the exact same hypothesis. Like, God is basically the one that's keeping the laws of nature in play.
Well, here I was taking him to saying there is no laws of nature, because that's what required fine-tuning, right? There is no set of laws of nature that are doing it. It's just
But what are the laws of nature other than just descriptions of the way that the world is sort of operating?
Well, I think they're God sustaining activity, how God sustains the causal power. So I mean, that's my view. God is sustaining it, but here it's God does it directly, so you can't find an order in the way God does it. So you're hypothesizing life without being able to find order in your environment, because when you start finding order, you're finding laws. And then, so I think that's where the hypothesis is going. I mean, way I initially interpret it as saying, but then I think there's reasons why God would want to create a universe that had predictable order, partly for we can have free will. If we couldn't predict anything, we couldn't really be much of agents at all. So it makes sense then there'd be a predictable world, and a predictable world is one with laws. And then when you get laws, the claim is that it sure seems like laws need to be fine-tuned to do, if you have these underlying laws, to get complex structures like us.
Josh, anything to add before we move on?
Yeah, well, so I've been sort of pondering, what's behind the worry there. So one thought is that the worry is that, like, God being all powerful wouldn't need to fine tune anything to get interesting complexity.
In fact, that's actually the next objection. If God had to do it the way that it is, he's not all powerful.
Yeah. And so then the idea is that you can almost turn this around into an argument against God. So the idea is we find out that looks like the universe has to be finely tuned to get interesting complexity, but that would be surprising if there were an all-powerful being behind the scenes. An all-powerful being, there shouldn't be any need for fine-tuning. And so then the fact that we observe fine-tuning, that disconfirms theism.
Maybe he would just create a universe full of angels, spiritual beings.
Or you could get complexity without... Go ahead, Robin. I want to hear what
the question is, could God create another kind of mathematical law structure? Because within this law structure, you do need fine-tuning. I mean, honestly, I don't know the answer to that. Because like you said, with your computer programming, it's very hard, even though you're God in that world, and you have all power within the computer program, the code you want to write, to get complexity. So maybe anyone would need fine-tuning in order to get that. But let's suppose God could have got it without fine-tuning. There's still a reason why God would have done it via fine-tuning, and that's so that there would be evidence for God's existence within the universe itself. So God wants to leave some kind of evidence for God's own existence at some level. Because a lot of people have complained, they say, well, why is God so hidden? Well, if God leaves evidence in the form of fine-tuning, then that's one way of God is just getting a little peek in that God exists for those who are willing to pursue the truth about things. So I don't even see why, even if God could do it, why would that make it implausible that God could create a life-permitting universe without fine-tuning? How does that make it unlikely that God would have created a universe that required fine-tuning?
Yeah, and then I just want to add that I do think that it had to be fine-tuned. That just by reason that when you just divide up the conceptual space, there's still a narrow band in logic. Then you might say, well, maybe God could have made different logic. But I don't think that's right. I actually think logic is built into the fabric of the foundation, and that God couldn't make himself not exist and exist at the same time. That's just not possible. And so if that's right, then that at least opens up the possibility that there are fine-tuning requirements that are built into the nature of necessity, that it's just impossible to get complex creatures without setting some dials in a particular way.
Just like God can't make 2 + 2 = 5.
Right.
God can't create circles that are squares. So, I mean, maybe there is bounds, but I'm saying if there isn't,
yeah.
So what? How does that undermine the argument?
All right, let's move on. We only have, I guess, two. We'll go through two more objections. This one is what I categorize as false positives. There may be aspects of our universe that, if they were different, we would still consider to be fine-tuned. If constants were such that interstellar travel were possible, we'd consider that to be evidence for design. As it is, we only count the points in our favor.
So what they want to say is that if things were different, then so we're overlooking negative evidence. That's what they're saying, things that we would count against the hypothesis.
Yeah, we're only looking at things that point in our favor.
Well, that's true for the fine-tuning. We're looking at a thing that's evidence for theism. But atheists are quite good at finding things against theism, like the problem of evil. And no theist denies there isn't a problem there. So that's the thing.
Well, actually, I know a bunch of theists that deny there's a problem there.
Well, deny that there's at least a superficial problem there.
Yeah.
At least on the surface, there's a problem of all good, all powerful God. So whether you can solve the problem or not, or answer the objection, that's another question. So that's what I mean, at least on the surface. So you would have to show that you'd have to explicitly say what those other features are that are supposedly count against the theism. And why should theists have to search for those? Let the atheists do that. And they've already pointed out various features, particularly the problem of evil. So I guess we have human beings as a whole have looked at what seem to be the major pieces of evidence for and against.
Anything to add, Josh?
Right, yeah, and it's not just theists collecting arguments for their side and atheists collecting arguments for their side. I remember watching a very interesting talk by Mike Humer where he presented the fine-tuning argument and defended it against objections, and at the end offered it as evidence for theism. He himself not a theist, and then the next week gave another talk with some other data as evidence against theism. And so I think it is useful to just separate arguments. And again, I mean, any truth seeker is going to have to look at as much data, as they can, and just keep seeking the data. So in that sense, I like that objection because I think it displays a kind of virtue of truth seeking. Like, let's look at all the evidence. I think that's right.
Yeah, we should look at all, but I'm claiming people have been doing that.
Sure.
Oh yeah. All right, so here's so let's maybe do one more objection and then talk about the multiverse just for a couple minutes, because it's unfortunately it didn't really pop up a whole lot in the responses, which was kind of confusing. But let me just get through this last one. So it says this one is categorized as only one sample, and we talked about this at the outset when you were describing the argument. We have nothing to compare our universe to, so we have very little basis to assert what a universe with different tuning would be like. All we know is that we're well suited for where we live, which is what an evolutionary model predicts. We have a sample size of 1 for the universe. We cannot know what a non-fine-tuned example looks like.
I want to just illustrate that objection and then throw it to you, Robin. I was thinking about, okay, what is the objection there? And here's a way of illustrating what it might be. So imagine we go to Mars and we find this blue sphere. Okay, and it's the only blue sphere on Mars we've ever encountered. We have a sample size of 1. And we don't have any sort of other cases to test what explains this blue sphere. So we should really just be in the dark about what explains the blue sphere. And maybe then the worry is that we don't have other universes. The universe is like the blue sphere. So we have this universe that's finely tuned. And you might think, well, one hypothesis is that design explains that, but we don't have other cases to test that against.
Well, but that was the case of in any argument about the past, for instance, like I said, with continental drift theory or evolution, we don't have other cases we only have one sample size. The Big Bang theory. So if you're pressing the one sample size objection, throw out the Big Bang theory, throw out the theory of evolution, throw out continental drift theory, and so on and so forth.
The origin of human beings.
Right.
Yeah.
So
history more generally.
And we do have, what you do is, how do you know what would happen otherwise, where you use the laws we know, because the laws we know allow us to predict, like, if there was a mile-wide iron sphere and you dropped it on Earth, it would leave a big dent in the Earth. Okay. If you dropped it from, way out in orbit and it fell down, well, no one's going to do that, but I don't think. But you'd still be able to predict what would happen. So you can predict what would happen if things were different, whether there'd be complex life or not, just same way.
All right. So I did want to take just a couple minutes and talk about the multiverse. One of the things that was really helpful to me when I was reading through your long paper in the natural, what is it? The Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. You distinguish between 2 versions of the multiverse, and I think that was really helpful. So let's just take a couple minutes, talk about the multiverse, and then we'll close our time out tonight.
So the multiverse is the idea, and I should say it's the most common objection by far that physicists and cosmologists give to the theistic inference. So if you're a physicist and cosmologist, you get into the fine-tuning stuff, and you're not a theist, you'll go for the multiverse. Hardly few of them will just say, we're just here by chance. Okay, they're usually impressed enough by the fine-tuning evidence. So the multiverse is the idea that there are a huge, vast number of universes, and given enough universes in which the initial conditions, the laws of physics and the fundamental parameters like the strength of gravity or the cosmological constant vary, eventually one's going to turn out to be just right for life. And then when life develops on that universe, it's going to look back and say, wow, aren't we lucky to exist in a fine-tuned universe? Well, first of all, under that hypothesis, it's not improbable that there would be a universe fine-tuned for life. And since life can only exist in a universe that's fine-tuned, it's not surprising that the beings in that universe will observe themselves be fine-tuned. Usually the analogy is given like, the fact that the conditions on our planet have to be just right, its distance from the sun and other conditions have to be just right for life, is not surprising if there's many, many planets, because eventually one of them is going to be just right for life, have the right distance from its star, and the observers can only arise on planets just right for life, and hence it's no surprise that they find themselves on such a planet. So it's a similar kind of analogy. So then there's two kinds of multiverse hypotheses. One is by far the most common is I call a universal generator hypothesis, or some physical process that generates the universes. Just like the Big Bang is the physical process that generates the galaxies and then generates the planets, right? So there's some process that generates the universe. The other one is just these universes just always existed. And usually that takes the form of all possible universes existing. Any kind of possible physical reality exists somewhere in some region. There's a region of space-time for it. Okay. So
so what's the response? Well, first of all, do you think that this is a good objection to the argument?
I think it has a possibility of taking away some of the fine-tuning, but I don't think in general the objection works. First of all, let's focus on the universe generator one. In the universe generator hypothesis, that you would still need the generator itself to be fine-tuned. And you can actually look at, the various scenarios offered. You still need, like this inflationary cosmology superstring theory, things still have to be set right, has to have the right laws to produce all these universes. Just like the Big Bang has to be just right to even produce one planet. So it's the same thing. The Big Bang produces the many planets. The universe generation produces the many universe. Just like the Big Bang has to be generated to give fine-tune, like has to have the right value of the cosmological constant to give rise to any planets at all. Universe generator also has to be fine-tuned. So you've kicked the fine-tuning back one level to the universe generator itself. That's one of the objections. Another objection is that, and this applies particularly to the case of entropy, it's the fine-tuning of entropy is the initial order of the universe. It's far, far more probable to get isolated regions of order and then everywhere else chaos than it is to get a universe orderly throughout. So you would expect
use your monkey typewriter.
Yeah,
analogy.
that's what I was just going to do. So if you had like a monkey typewriting, and let's suppose a local region of order enough to have observers is like a single sentence that makes sense. Okay, so
from a room full of monkeys,
yeah,
basically,
so a
just
room
going at
full
a
of monkeys
typewriter.
are just typing randomly on a typewriter. Occasionally, you would get a single sentence, and so if you looked at all those single sentences you get, the vast majority of them would be surrounded by pages with, no much order off, sentences, things that made sequenced letters that made no sense at all. So it's vastly more probable to get a small region of order surrounded by chaos than to have, let's say, the monkeys typing and every single letter in an entire book makes sense. That'd be just enormously less probable. So your most probable case in that scenario is single sentences surrounded by disorder. So in this multiverse scenario, by far the most probable is these isolated observers called Boltzmann brains. And at least under standard measures of probability, that's not really very controversial that that's what would happen.
Josh,
And so they just,
I was just going to see, Josh, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
that's how where we should find ourselves, in a isolated observers surrounded by chaos.
I'm good. The only thing to add really would be that when I think about it, I think about it as much as I can through that sort of conceptual landscape to see what I could possibly see, even just by reason. And the results of that come to the same thing, which is that by reason, it looks like with the foundational mind, the kinds of universes with life in it is going to be different than what I would expect without that foundational mind. And there are various ways that we can spell this out. And I don't necessarily want to go into those details because it's just
I'm going to have to run up and plug
Yeah.
my computer in. It's almost
Right,
out of battery juice.
Yeah.
It's been gobbling up. So
That's okay.
I don't want it to just die right before we end.
So one of the details has to do with Mike Roda's argument from ratios. And I think you have a whole nother time with him on that. So I don't want to enter into that necessarily.
Yeah. So Robin, I don't know if you're able to follow along with what I'm about to say here. I was just going to summarize basically where you've gone so far in responding to the multiverse.
Right. Okay.
And
I'm going to kick this. Okay. Oops.
Yeah, no worries.
I got to go upstairs and get this thing plugged in.
So the first thing that you said was basically it runs the risk of just pushing fine-tuning back a step. And then the second one was a sort of Boltzmann brain worry where we're going to get pockets of order, and that's going to sort of dominate the multiverse. And so that's what we should conclude, basically, if we want to say that a multiverse exists, is that probably we are a Boltzmann brain, but then you can run like a modus ponens or a modus tollens on that no, we are not a Boltzmann brain, so therefore probably the multiverse is not.
And let me give you my third, is that and this goes to my current work, is that the universe is not just fine-tuned for life, but the existence of science and technology. So that cannot be explained by a multiverse, because a multiverse relies on the observer selection principle, that observers can only exist in a universe fine-tuned for them. But we could exist, observers, if there's an additional fine-tune for scientific discovery, there are going to be many universes in which observers exist that are not very discoverable scientifically. And so it's only going to be just like a very small proportion of those universes are going to be such that they allow for the level of scientific discovery we have in our universe. So then it's surprising under the even under the multiverse that we find ourselves in such a universe that allows for the level of science and technology, but not surprising under theism if you think there's some value in science and technology.
So let's go ahead and close the evening out, though. And obviously, we could discuss all of these objections a lot more. We could talk about discoverability a lot more. But here's one question for you, and this actually just popped up from Luke Barnes. He's in the live chat right now. When does your book come out?
Oh, you mean on the discoverability one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping to get the main pieces done by the end of the summer. It was a lot more. Something had a family emergency last year, so that delayed it for almost a year. But it also was more involved than I thought. So, Luke, it's coming along, and you'll be one of the first ones. I plan on sending the chapters to you. So, don't worry, and I appreciate your work on the topic.
Awesome. Well, any last thoughts before we close it out, Josh? Well, let's start with you, Josh.
Well, thanks for having me on. I think that, these are big questions, and I think sometimes people can feel a little bit lost trying to figure out kind of what to think. And of course, there's also the battles that happen, and there's a kind of energy that people get from entering into debates. And sometimes I think that there are kind of two distractions that can happen. One is that people feel like it's impossible to really make progress on these big questions. They're just too big. And then the other is there's these debates where arguments get weaponized. And so now people are more kind of working on beefing up arguments, almost like to defend their own rationality or to attack another tribe or something. And that really just creates this cloud of distraction, I think, from truth seekers just coming together and just investigating the nature of the foundation. And one of the things I just love about Robin is that, we were talking, I think before we started, that Robin, he's like his own skeptic, and he's never quite sure, and he's always thinking, he's always thinking about like 5 different objections, and then he's like going deeper. And I think that's just the right attitude to really make progress on this. And then when we do that, when we really seek, okay, what can we find out about the foundation, and we just look at the data, then I think we can really make progress. And the fine-tuning data is one piece in a larger array of data. But from my own perspective, it was one of the pieces that moved me out of a seeking, searching agnostic to thinking, okay, it looks like the foundation of reality is it's probably not just chance or random. There's probably some mind that would explain the exquisite fine-tuning of the universe. And so I don't know what final thought to leave. Just I feel like I want people to feel encouraged, to be encouraged, to keep seeking and searching, and to make truth the goal, and to make progress.
Yeah, so let's turn it over to you, Robin. Just any last thoughts on the conversation that we've had tonight? We had a little rocky start, some technical difficulties at the outset, but we got going.
I want to say, I think, because I think a lot of the objections are kind of answered in themselves once you look at the arguments. So one thing is, in pursuing arguments like this, make sure you look at kind of what are considered the best arguments in favor of it. Look at the premises, and then try to be clear on like what premise are you objecting to? Are you objecting to whether the conclusion follows from the premise? Are you objecting to this premise or that premise? I mean, at least that's what we're trained to do in philosophy, because that's how you make the sort of progress Josh was talking about, is you try to cast the argument as clearly as possible and then support each of the premises. And if you're objecting to it, then you try to be as clear as your objection on what premise. If you're objecting to the argument, what premise are you objecting to? Or are you objecting to that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise? Otherwise, you're just throwing stuff out there. And so I think, it's being careful in that regard is really important if we're going to move forward. And I also do agree with Josh. It's too easy for all this stuff to be weaponized. I think you have to have a certain, tell yourself you could be wrong and face the fact. Don't be too attached to your own points of view. And I think, for speaking for the theist side of this, I think that's really important for theist is if you're a theist, it's not your job to convince people. I think your job is to be as truthful as you can be, as careful as you can be, and try to explicate carefully, truthfully the evidence as you see it, and as be honest as possible in understanding the people's objections to it and actually trying to clarify their objections. I think Josh did a pretty good job of that.
Yeah, and what I would suggest to any atheists that are watching is that the objections that we covered tonight aren't necessarily what I or what people working on this argument consider to be the best objections to the fine-tuning argument, but they are nevertheless the types of objections that get thrown around a lot. And, when I originally was putting this talk together, this chat, this live hangout, whatever we're doing tonight, I originally wanted to talk about the normalization problem, the multiverse a lot more, and even objections to the principle of indifference that have come up in conversations I've had with really intelligent atheists. And I decided to not do that tonight because those are not really the objections that people, I guess, care about or are actually raising when you ask people, what are your objections to the fine-tuning argument? So maybe we'll do that later on down the road, but I think that it's important every now and then to address sort of what people are objecting to, like actually what their objections are, and maybe try to work through those and figure out like, well,
I
hey,
wonder if some of these objections are just kind of off the cuff thoughts versus carefully considered objections,
or responses to other versions of the argument that are popularized.
Yeah, or maybe they've heard it from someone else and just thought it sounded good and it sounded convincing, and so they just sort of ran with it.
It takes work to go find the best version and then look carefully at it. And something at this level of importance, I don't think you could just be casually off the cuff either offer arguments for or against. And usually if it's an obvious objection, the other side has probably already thought about it and probably has at least a decent response to it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Well, anyways, thanks guys again for joining me, Josh and Robin. It's been awesome. I'm super tired. Like I woke up really early. We had this thing that we went to, but anyways, thanks guys for joining me. And
that was good.
Yeah, and thank you to the live audience for you guys watching, and for anyone who's not watching live. I hope that you were edified by our conversation tonight. If you have any more objections that you'd like to send, then check for the link in the description. I have a little way that you can contact me. And if I can't answer it, then I'll send it to someone who can. But yeah, so thanks for joining us tonight.
I want to say this is one of the most, and I've done quite a few interviews. This is the most thorough of them all, of looking at the huge number of objections.
Oh, awesome.
So this would be one of the major places to recommend if you want to, go look at objections and how somebody would a defender of the fine-tuning argument would answer those objections.
Well, maybe what we'll do is like a part 2, and maybe we'll look at the more serious philosophical, physical, from the physics and stuff, and maybe take a much deeper look at the multiverse, and maybe we can have this as a kind of 2-part series. We'll explore that in email later on, but let's go ahead and close out the night. Thanks again, guys, for watching, and we'll see you next time. Oh, and then go check out our website. We don't just have a YouTube channel. I say that a lot, but we have a website. We have a lot of stuff going on there, podcasts and everything. So capturingchristianity.com is the place to go. So, all right, we'll see you guys later. Have a good night.
Thanks.